Ethan started his evening thinking it would be a normal drive, something simple and quiet, just a short trip through the calm streets of Seattle before heading back home. He had offered to drop his mother-in-law Linda at a nearby place she needed to visit, and she had agreed with a soft smile that felt normal at first, nothing unusual, nothing alarming. But as the car moved forward and the city lights slowly began to glow against the fading sky, something about the atmosphere began to feel different in a way Ethan could not explain. Linda sat beside him with calm posture, hands folded gently in her lap, looking out of the window as if lost in thoughts that she did not share, and Ethan kept his focus on the road while his mind drifted toward his own life, especially his marriage with Claire, which had been feeling heavier in recent weeks. Conversations had become short, eye contact had reduced, and even small moments of warmth seemed rare, yet he kept telling himself it was just stress, just routine life pressure, nothing deeper than that. But silence inside the car that evening felt different, almost intentional, as if it carried meaning he could not read yet. Linda suddenly broke that silence with a soft question about how he was really doing, not just in work or routine, but in life. The question sounded simple, but it made Ethan uncomfortable in a subtle way because no one had asked him like that in a long time. He gave a polite answer saying he was fine and managing everything, but his voice lacked confidence even to himself. Linda nodded slowly as if she already knew the answer was incomplete, and then she turned slightly toward him, studying his face in a way that felt more personal than usual. Ethan kept his eyes forward but felt that attention on him, and it made him slightly tense. The road ahead was clear, traffic light, evening calm. Yet inside the car something was building quietly. Linda then spoke again, her voice softer than before, saying that sometimes people carry too much without showing it, and sometimes those closest to them fail to notice the weight. Ethan didn't respond right away, focusing instead on steering carefully, but her words stayed in his mind longer than expected because they felt oddly precise, like she was not just talking generally but referring to something specific. The car passed through a quieter stretch of road with trees lining both sides and fewer streetlights, and the fading sunlight made everything feel slightly more intimate and enclosed. Ethan adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, trying to shake off the strange feeling, but then something unexpected happened. Linda moved slightly closer, not dramatically but enough for Ethan to notice, and placed her hand lightly on his arm as if to get his attention. The touch was gentle but it startled him because it was not something he expected, especially not from her. His body reacted instantly with confusion and he glanced at her briefly before returning his eyes to the road, asking if everything was okay, but she did not remove her hand right away. Instead she looked at him with an expression that was calm but deeply unreadable, almost as if she was holding back words for a long time and had finally decided to let them slip out. Ethan felt his heart rate increase slightly because the situation no longer felt normal. The car continued moving but his focus was splitting between the road and the growing tension beside him. Linda finally spoke again, saying she had noticed changes in the house, in Claire, in him, and in the way everything felt distant lately. Her tone was not accusing but observant, almost sad, and Ethan felt a tightness in his chest because he had noticed those changes too but never said them out loud. He tried to respond logically, saying every marriage goes through phases and things would improve. But even as he said it he was not fully convinced. The silence returned for a moment but it was heavier now, filled with thoughts neither of them were expressing fully. Linda then sighed softly and leaned back slightly but her words continued to linger in the air, saying that sometimes people wait too long hoping things will fix themselves, and by the time they realize, distance becomes normal. Ethan felt uneasy because the conversation was moving into territory he did not expect or feel prepared for. His hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel as the road curved ahead, and for a brief second he had to adjust the car more carefully, his attention slipping under emotional pressure. Linda looked out of the window again but her hand slowly returned to her lap, though the emotional weight of her earlier touch remained in Ethan's mind. He began to wonder why this conversation was happening now, why she was saying these things in this tone, and what she truly meant behind her words. The car continued forward, but the atmosphere inside had completely changed. What started as a normal drive now felt like a quiet emotional confrontation unfolding in real time, and Ethan had no idea that this was only the beginning of something that would soon challenge everything he believed about trust, family, and the fragile balance of his marriage, because in that moment, even the simplest silence between them no longer felt safe or ordinary anymore. Ethan kept driving with a tight feeling in his chest after Linda's words, trying to convince himself that it was just an awkward conversation, nothing more. But the air inside the car no longer felt normal, it felt heavier, like every word spoken had created invisible pressure between them. Linda sat quietly for a moment, looking forward, then slowly turned back toward him again as if she had decided not to hold back anymore, and what she said next changed the direction of everything he thought he understood. She spoke in a calm but deeply personal tone, saying she had been observing things at home for a long time, the distance between Ethan and Claire, the lack of warmth in the house, the way conversations ended too quickly, and how both of them seemed to live in the same space but not the same emotional world. Ethan felt uncomfortable because hearing it from her made it feel more real, more direct, as if someone outside the marriage had confirmed what he had been trying to ignore. He kept his eyes on the road, but his focus was breaking. Linda continued saying that Claire was not the only one struggling, that Ethan himself had been carrying silent frustration, exhaustion, and emotional emptiness that he never spoke about. And those words hit him harder than he expected because they were true in ways he had never admitted even to himself. The car moved through a quieter stretch of road where the houses became fewer and the trees thicker, and the fading daylight made everything feel more enclosed. Linda's voice softened as she said that sometimes people stay in relationships hoping things will fix naturally, but in reality silence creates distance that slowly becomes permanent. Ethan finally responded in a controlled but firm tone, telling her that this was not something she should be discussing, especially in that way, and that it was a private matter between him and Claire. But even as he said it, his voice lacked full confidence, because deep inside he knew the emotional gap was real. Linda nodded slightly but did not stop. She said she wasn't trying to interfere but only pointing out what already existed, and that ignoring reality only made people feel more alone over time. Ethan felt his grip tighten on the steering wheel again as the road curved ahead, and for a moment he had to slow down slightly, not because of traffic but because his mind was overwhelmed. Linda shifted slightly in her seat and placed her hand near her lap again, but the emotional weight of her earlier touch still lingered in his mind, making him feel even more unsettled. He glanced at her briefly and noticed something different in her expression, not aggression or manipulation, but something closer to loneliness mixed with emotional honesty, and that confused him more than anything else, because he had never thought of her in that way. She then said quietly that people often assume love problems only exist between couples, but sometimes emotional connection fades from all sides of a family, and silence spreads across everyone involved. Ethan didn't reply immediately because he was trying to process everything while still focusing on the road, and the combination of emotional pressure and driving started to affect his concentration. The car slightly drifted once before he corrected it quickly, and that small moment made him realize how distracted he had become. Linda noticed it too and told him softly to focus on driving, her tone now more careful, but the tension between them remained. Ethan felt a mix of frustration and confusion building inside him, because part of him wanted to shut the conversation down completely, but another part could not ignore the truth in what she was saying. As they approached a quieter road with fewer cars and longer stretches of silence, Linda finally spoke again in a lower voice, saying that she had no intention of creating problems but she could no longer pretend everything was fine when she could see everyone suffering in different ways. Ethan felt a sharp emotional conflict because he did not want to accept that idea, yet he also could not fully deny it. The car slowed slightly at a bend, and he realized how much his mind was affecting his control. The situation was no longer just a conversation, it was turning into something deeper, something that made him question not just his marriage but his own emotional state. Linda looked out of the window again and said quietly that sometimes people step closer to emotional gaps without realizing it, not to break anything, but simply because they feel the emptiness too. Ethan's heart sank slightly at those words because they felt too personal, too direct. And he finally told her in a low but firm voice that whatever was happening between him and Claire would be handled privately, and it was not something that needed outside involvement. Linda didn't argue, she simply nodded and looked down for a moment, as if accepting that she had said what she needed to say, but the silence that followed was not peaceful anymore. It was filled with tension, unanswered emotions, and thoughts neither of them were willing to fully express, and as the car continued forward into the dimming evening light, Ethan realized that something between them had shifted permanently in that ride, even if neither of them said it out loud, and that realization made the rest of the drive feel heavier than anything he had experienced before. Ethan finally slowed the car as they approached the familiar street near his home, but the silence inside the vehicle felt different now, heavier and more meaningful than before, like both of them were carrying thoughts they could no longer ignore. Linda sat quietly with her hands folded again, looking forward without speaking, and Ethan kept his eyes on the road but his mind was still tangled in everything that had just happened, the conversation replaying in fragments, each sentence feeling sharper the more he thought about it. When the house came into view, its warm lights glowing softly against the evening sky, Ethan felt a strange mix of relief and tension at the same time, as if reaching home did not mean the end of the situation but only the beginning of its consequences. He parked the car carefully, took a slow breath, and for a moment neither of them moved, the engine ticking softly as the silence settled between them one last time. Linda finally spoke in a quiet voice, saying she never intended to create distance or confusion. She only spoke what she felt had been building in silence around all of them. Ethan didn't respond immediately, because he knew anything he said now would carry weight beyond just words. After a pause he nodded slightly, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just acknowledging that the conversation had happened and could not be erased. He then stepped out of the car first, walking around to open the passenger door, maintaining a calm and controlled expression even though his mind was still unsettled. Linda stepped out slowly, adjusting her coat, and for a brief moment they stood together outside the car without speaking. The night air was cooler now, and the world around them felt too normal compared to what had just unfolded inside that small space. Ethan closed the car door gently and looked toward the house where the lights were still on, where Claire was waiting inside unaware of the emotional storm that had passed just minutes ago. Linda looked in the same direction but did not say anything further. She simply gave a small, almost uncertain nod before turning slightly toward the walkway. Ethan noticed that she seemed different now, less confident than before, almost as if the weight of her own words had settled on her too. But he did not stop her, because he needed space, clarity, and control over his thoughts. As she walked toward the house entrance, Ethan remained near the car for a few seconds, taking in the quiet street, the distant sound of passing cars, and the faint rustle of trees in the wind, trying to ground himself back into reality. Then he slowly followed, each step toward the house feeling heavier than usual. When he reached the front door, he paused again, his hand resting on the handle, not because he feared entering, but because he knew that whatever he carried inside him now would change how he saw everything. He finally opened the door and stepped in. The warmth of the house hitting him immediately, lights soft, atmosphere familiar, and Claire standing in the living room looking up at him with a calm but slightly tired expression. She asked him how the drive went in a simple tone, unaware of the emotional tension that still lingered inside him. Ethan forced a small nod and said it was fine, his voice steady but distant. Linda walked in behind him a moment later and greeted Claire normally, placing her emotions behind a composed expression as if nothing unusual had happened. But Ethan noticed the subtle difference in how everyone carried themselves, as if invisible lines had shifted between them. Claire turned her attention briefly to her mother, asking if everything went well, and Linda replied softly that the air outside helped clear her mind. Ethan stood there quietly watching the exchange, feeling like an outsider in his own home for the first time. He realized that nothing had physically changed in the room, yet everything emotionally felt altered: the way they spoke, the way they avoided certain pauses, the way silence now felt loaded with meaning. Claire eventually walked toward the kitchen, leaving him and Linda in the hallway for a moment, and in that brief gap of silence, Ethan looked at Linda and saw something in her expression that was not there before, a quiet understanding mixed with regret, as if she too realized that what had been said in the car could not be undone, but neither of them spoke about it. Because there were no safe words left for that moment, Ethan then slowly moved further inside the house, feeling the weight of decisions he had not yet made but knew he would have to face soon, because the truth was no longer just between him and Linda, it had entered the space between him and Claire as well, and as he stood in the center of his home surrounded by familiar walls that suddenly felt unfamiliar, he understood that the real challenge was not what had been said in the car, but what would happen next when silence could no longer hide what each of them now knew in their hearts.